I command thee now!
One of my favorite additions to Elden Ring's combat, and in my opinion the most useful one, is the stance system. This is a public mechanic, meaning that the game tells you about it, but it runs on a hidden system. Nowhere in the game can we see a stance stat, not in enemies and certainly not in weapons. The game tells us that some attacks may break an enemy's stance, giving you a chance to perform a critical hit. It continues to say that charge attacks and jump attacks make it particularly easy to break an enemy's stance. This is the description that we get in the tutorial area of the game, and while it is enough to give us the idea of what's going on, it is far from a full mechanical description. And so, my dear viewer, this is the objective of the video. We are going to review the full mechanic. What is it, what does it do, and how does it work? Let's get started. In order to be able to fully understand the mechanic, we first need to talk about what stance actually is. As a mechanic, stance represents the enemy's balance in combat. It is an enemy-only fixed stat. This means two things. First of all, players do not have the stance stat. The player version of stance is poise, and we will cover it in another video. And second, stance acts much like HP in the sense that it has a singular value. Some enemies have 30 stance points, others have 65. Bosses tend to have much more stance, reaching 100 points in many cases. An enemy's stance is determined by the game, and it never changes. Now, stance is not a stand-alone mechanic. In fact, stance is part of a larger mechanical system, one that we call poise. Poise is the general mechanic that governs the combat balance of every single entity of the game. From here, we have to divide it into two sub-mechanics, stance and, once again, poise. Stance within the game files is described by the parameter super armor, and poise, again, within the game files is described by the parameter toughness. Stance, or super armor, is the sub-mechanic that affects PvE enemies, and poise, or toughness, is the sub-mechanic that affects the player character. In essence, these two sub-mechanics are very similar, if not the same, and the only thing that changes with them is who they affect and what kind of effect they bring to the table. In this video, we will focus on the PvE side of the system. That is stance, and that is what we're going to analyze. As we mentioned before, stance acts a lot like HP. In the same way that an enemy loses HP if they are attacked, they also take stance damage. In Elden Ring, every single attack deals stance damage. Melee attacks, Ashes of Wars, and spells, both sorceries and incantations, all deal stance damage. The amount of stance damage that each attack deals is decided on a case-by-case basis. Every single attack, Ash of War, sorcery, and incantation deals a specific amount of stance damage. In the case of weapons, it is divided by weapon types. For example, all Great Hammers deal the same amount of stance damage with their attacks. All Great Hammer R1s are the same, their R2s are the same, so on and so forth. The same goes for straight swords, colossal weapons, whips, etc. Furthermore, some weapon attacks deal more stance damage than others. For most weapon types, R2s will deal more stance damage than R1s. In the same way, charged R2s will deal more damage than their uncharged counterparts. Jump attacks are also very good at breaking the enemy's stance, but it is guard counters, the ones that provide the highest amount of stance damage for all weapons. As for Ashes of War and spells, each and every one is different. For example, the R2 attack of the square of Ash of War deals 40 stance damage, while the incantation Dragon Maw deals 45 points of stance damage. As mentioned before, the game does not tell us this anywhere, so if we are interested in knowing the specific stance damage of a particular attack, we have no choice but to look it up in the game files. If you're the type of player that intends to research the specific stance damage of each attack, then it is important that we understand how stance damage is calculated for weapons. Most sources of information will give you the total stance damage already sorted out, but it is not a bad idea to understand how the process works. The formula to find the total stance damage of a specific weapon attack is as follows. Total stance damage is equal to the base stance damage multiplied by the stance motion value. Let's break this down. The base stance damage is a predetermined value that Elden Ring gives to each weapon type. Great hammers are one of my favorite weapon types, so we will use them as an example. The base stance damage value of the great hammer weapons is 7. Now, as for the motion values, I covered this concept in a prior video where we break down the system that Elden Ring uses to calculate its damage. If you're interested in the full explanation, do not hesitate to check it out. There is a timestamp for motion values. That said, for the purposes of this video, please understand that the stance motion value is the representation of the force of an attack. Stronger attacks have a higher motion value than weaker attacks. Motion values are also predetermined by Elden Ring, and if we look up the guard counter for great hammers, we will see that the stance motion value for this attack is 6. Next, we input this information into the formula. The total stance damage of a great hammer guard counter is the base stance damage of 7 multiplied by the stance motion value of 6. 6 times 7 is 42. And this represents the stance damage of this particular attack. Like I said before, if you're looking up this information, you will most likely find it already calculated for you. That said, if you ever do find yourself actually needing to do the work, this is how it's done. As we use attacks to deal stance damage to our enemies, sooner or later their stance will deplete. It will reach 0. When this happens, their stance breaks. An enemy with a broken stance is put into a vulnerable position that gives us, the player, an opportunity to get free damage. There are 3 different scenarios for a broken enemy stance. First is when the enemy kneels to the ground. This allows us to get a riposte or a backstab depending on whether we attack them from the front or the back. Second, it's when the enemy falls to the ground and a yellow glowing spot appears somewhere in the body. This allows us to get a riposte, only if we attack this particular spot. On every other body part, our attacks will deal regular damage. And finally, the third case is when the enemy topples and falls to the floor, but no glowing spot appears in their body. This means that there is no opportunity for a critical attack, but we can still take advantage of multiple seconds of free damage. Make sure you use your strongest attacks in this specific scenario. Now that we know how the stance system works, it is also important to know how the enemy's stance behaves. To this effect, we need to understand that stance damage degenerates over time. Looking at it from the enemy's perspective, their stance points regenerate if they are not attacked. This is put into place in order to favor player aggression and to reward those that keep the pressure on the enemy. If you keep on the offensive, then the stance damage that you will deal will not be lost, and you will have a higher chance of getting the break. On the other hand, if you play passively and only attack when it's 100% safe, then the stance damage you deal will begin to decrease after a few seconds, and it will be harder to break the enemy. You can see this in the example that I am showing you. If I maintain my offensive, I am able to break this enemy's stance in a few hits. That said, if I back off and give the enemy time to breathe, then their stance damage will regenerate, and I will need more attacks to get the break. Of course, if we are dealing with a regenerating stat, then the obvious questions that we have to ask are, when does stance damage begin to regenerate? And how fast does an enemy's stance actually recover? Let's start with the when. The answer here is that different enemies start to regenerate their stance points at different times. There is a system in place in which the regeneration timer is inversely proportional to the amount of stance that an enemy has. This means that the higher the enemy's stance, the longer it will take to start regenerating. Looking at it from the other perspective, the lower the enemy's stance, the faster it will start to regenerate. From here, we can work with a few examples. If an enemy has 30 stance points, then it will take about 2 seconds before they start regenerating. If the enemy has 65 stance points, then it will take about 5 seconds before the regeneration process begins. And finally, if the enemy has 100 stance points, they will have to wait about 8 seconds before they start recovering it. And finally, we need to cover the speed at which an enemy's stance regenerates. Fortunately, the game cuts us some slack in this department and makes it a universal value. The stance points of every single enemy regenerates at the rate of 13 points per second. As I mentioned before, this system is put into place in order to reward those players that are more aggressive. While being passive is definitely a safer strategy, it will cost us some big damage opportunities. My dear viewer, I believe that you're a smart player, so I am sure that you have already realized that a regenerating stance can present an issue. We need to figure out a way to keep an enemy's stance damage stable while we create breathing room. The answer to this is throwing knives. As we mentioned before, an enemy's stance will begin to regenerate if we do not attack them. Now, to be more specific, the regeneration will start if we do not deal any stance damage. HP damage, in this case, is inconsequential. We only care about stance damage. Throwing knives constitute an attack, and they deal exactly 1 stance damage, so we can use them to back away from the enemy, create space, but still keep the stance damage from recovering. Like we mentioned before, it does not matter how much damage we actually deal. All we need is for the throwing knife to hit the enemy in order to keep the stance from recovering. In this way, we can use space and time to mount a better attack without sacrificing the stance damage that we have already cost the enemy. Please note that any ranged attack will serve this purpose as long as it deals stance damage. Throwing knives are just a good example of a quick and easy solution. Use this to your advantage in order to capitalize on stance breaks while minimizing the risks of a full close quarters encounter. The last thing to take into consideration in regards to the stance system is what happens after we break an enemy's stance. The answer is nothing. By this I mean one very important thing, and that is that after an enemy's stance is broken, their stance stat remains the same. Normally, when it comes to other mechanics like status effects, once you proc a status effect on an enemy, for example bleed, they become more resistant to the specific effect, and it takes longer to proc it again. This does not happen with stance. Let's follow the example that I'm showing you on the screen. What you are seeing is me attacking an omen from the underground sewers beneath the Leyndell capital. This enemy has a total of 65 stance points. In this case, we are using a Great Hammer Charged R2, which deals 39 stance damage, and a Great Hammer Jump R2, which deals 26 stance damage. This gives us exactly the 65 stance damage that we need. You can clearly see every attack I do, and I show you exactly how much stance damage it deals until we reach the point when we break the enemy. After this break, I step away from the enemy and repeat the process. On the second group of attacks, I break the enemy's stance again, and we can count another 65 points of stance damage. This means that there is no progressive increase to the stance stat after a break occurs. The stat is completely static, and an enemy will always have the same stance points regardless of the circumstance. This is very important because it allows us to create attack patterns that can keep the pressure on the enemy and break their stance over and over again. With a planned and controlled attack, the total amounts of damage that we can produce can be very, very powerful. We have already established that every single attack deals a different amount of stance damage. Weapons share the same values within the same type, but spells and Ashes of War all have their own data. If you're planning on counting your stance damage, then it will be necessary to look up the exact amount that your favorite attacks deal, or calculate it yourself. There is no way around this. That being said, Elden Ring also provides a series of stance damage modifiers that change the exact amount of damage that our character deals. Some modifiers are bonuses, while others are penalties. Let's take a look at them. Starting with the bonuses, the first one is attacking unaware enemies. It is very easy to understand, and it is also very easy to take advantage of this. If we attack an enemy that has not noticed us, the attack that we use will receive a bonus of 20% additional stance damage. Once the enemy does notice us and enters the battle, we lose the modifier. Make sure to take full advantage of it with your biggest hit. The second bonus is using your weapon with two hands. Another easy to understand situation that can prove to be very valuable. There are no external conditions to meet. All you have to do is two-hand your weapon of choice. When you do this, attacks with this weapon will deal additional stance damage. I do not specify a value because different attacks receive different bonuses from two-handing. For example, a one-handed R1 from a Great Hammer deals 12.95 stance damage. If we two-hand the Great Hammer, the same R1 will deal 16.8 stance damage. This is a 29.7% increase. On the other hand, a one-handed charged R2 from a Great Hammer deals 39.2 stance damage. If we two-hand the same Great Hammer, then the charged R2 will deal 42.7 stance damage. This is an 8.9% increase. The reason this happens is because two-handing the weapon increases the stance motion value of the attack, and each attack receives a different motion value increase. As we saw before, the higher the motion value, the higher the total damage. This bonus applies to every single attack that you do with a two-handed weapon. There are no exceptions, and this provides a lot of value. The third bonus to stance damage is easy to understand, but it is a lot harder to use because it works with much more specific scenarios. Some enemies have weak points that take additional stance damage. One of the best examples is the ankles of these giant golems. If you attack the ankles of these enemies, they will take additional stance damage and it will be much easier to break them. In this case, the ankles take about twice as much stance damage as any other body part. Please understand that each weak point of each enemy has a different modifier. Hitting these weak points will always give us more stance damage, but they each provide different bonuses. If we are curious about the specific values for a specific weak point of a specific enemy, we will need to look these up in the game files. The fourth bonus to stance damage comes in the form of the Flask of Physics. There is a specific tier, the Stone-Barbed Cracked tier, that increases the amount of stance damage we do after it is consumed. To be exact, it increases the stance damage of every single attack that comes from a weapon by 30%, and this effect lasts for 30 seconds. This includes the full moveset of each weapon and their Ashes of War. Unfortunately, this does not include spells. Sorceries and incantations do not receive the boost provided by this tier. Nevertheless, it is still a powerful tool that lasts a short time, so it will be important to plan its use accordingly. The final bonus that we need to talk about is the Ash of War Crag Blade. When we activate this skill, the weapon that we are wielding will deal an additional 10% stance damage for 60 seconds. This buff applies to every single attack for the duration of the skill. While a 10% boost may not seem like a lot at face value, the fact of the matter is that we get it on every single attack with no additional conditions, and that makes it a fantastic way to speed up enemy breaks. It is very easy to take advantage of this bonus, and that, my dear viewer, gives us a lot of value. Moving on to the penalties to stance damage, Elden Ring makes it harder to break a boss's stance if you're playing co-op. This penalty has two layers. If you're fighting a boss and you summon one phantom, you will deal a total of 40% less stance damage. Furthermore, if you summon two phantoms, the penalty will be greater and you will deal 60% less stance damage. These penalties make a lot of sense, as it balances the summoning mechanic by making it harder for players to lock the boss in a constant chain of stance breaks. On the other hand, these are some steep reductions, so if your phantoms are not pulling their weight, it will be very difficult to break the boss's stance. Keep this in mind when you request some jolly cooperation. The other penalty to our stance damage comes in the form of the New Game Plus mechanic. As we know, once we beat the game, we are able to move on to New Game Plus. If we beat it again, we can move on to New Game Plus 2. Each new game cycle increases the difficulty of the game up to the maximum, which is New Game Plus 7. Well, in regards to stance damage, our character will receive a penalty on each game cycle starting from New Game Plus 2 until we reach New Game Plus 7. The penalties are a stance damage reduction of 5% on New Game Plus 2, 10% on New Game Plus 3, 15% on New Game Plus 4, 20% on New Game Plus 5, 30% on New Game Plus 6, and 40% on New Game Plus 7. This progressive decrease of stance damage will certainly make the later New Game cycles harder, as we cannot rely so much on breaking the enemy. Keep this in mind as you advance. Finally, it is important to understand that all of these modifiers, both the bonuses we saw before and the penalties that we are seeing now, can stack with each other. Furthermore, the co-op and New Game Cycle penalties can both be mitigated by applying multiple bonuses. Learning how to combine these modifiers together can prove to be very efficient at bringing all enemies down to their knees. As you have seen, overall, the stance system is not complicated to understand or to use. It does have its details, and knowing them will give you more tools to increase the power of any build that you decide to run. If you're the type of player that likes to do a little bit of research, you will find that knowing the stance values of some key enemies can prove to be very useful. In the same way, understanding how much stance damage your weapon of choice deals with its attacks can bring your battle prowess to the next level. Breaking an enemy's stance is a fantastic way to increase overall DPS, and there are many options in the game that give us the opportunity to take full advantage of this mechanic. Personally, I really enjoy this system because it can be combined with the bigger weapons to great effect. I hope that you now have a greater understanding of how to use this tool, and you can begin to more efficiently command enemies to kneel. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I get to see you on the next one.